In 2025, a crane lifted 22 massive granite blocks from the floor of the Mediterranean. Some weighed over 80 tons. Door lintels, monumental jambs, pieces of something enormous, encrusted with centuries of marine growth, pulled from the silt for the first time since antiquity. These blocks once belonged to the Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. A tower that guided ships into harbor for over 1,500 years before earthquakes brought it down and the sea closed over what remained. But the lighthouse is only part of what's down there. Beneath the waters of Alexandria's harbor lies an entire ancient world. Palaces where Cleopatra held court, temples where scholars debated the nature of the universe, columns, statues, sphinxes, the ruins of one of the greatest cities ever built, now resting 20 feet below the surface. Exactly where they fell, exactly as they were in antiquity. Jean-Yves Empereur, the archaeologist who first mapped this underwater site, described it as completely different from any other urban excavation. There are no later occupation layers. The Hellenistic remains lie beneath the silt exactly as they did 2,000 years ago. It's as close to a time capsule as archaeology gets. In this video, I use modern AI tools to reconstruct what Alexandria once looked like, based on historical records, archaeological evidence, and ancient eyewitness accounts, allowing us to shift perspective, change camera angles, and move through a city that hasn't existed for centuries. This is the story of how the ancient world's greatest experiment in knowledge, power, and ambition was built, celebrated, and ultimately surrendered to the sea. It begins in 331 BC, when Alexander the Great arrives on the northern coast of Egypt. He's 25 years old, already the most powerful man alive, fresh from conquering Persia, and he's looking for a site to build a city that will carry his name forever. He finds a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea to the north and Lake Mareotis to the south. Offshore sits the island of Pharos, a natural shield against storms and high seas. Fresh water flows from the Nile through a network of canals. 2 harbors, one facing east, one west, offer safe anchorage in almost any wind. The geography is nearly perfect. Alexander sketches the initial plan himself, then hands it to his architect, Dinocrates of Rhodes. Dinocrates designs a sophisticated orthogonal grid with broad avenues cutting through the city at precise right angles, some stretching over 30 meters wide. This wasn't a settlement that grew naturally over generations. It was engineered from the very first stone. Historian Islam Issa described the founding vision as the Greek mind applied to Egyptian scale, strategic planning and philosophy meeting monumentalism and grandeur. A city that would think like Athens, but build like the pharaohs. Imagine standing on that empty coastline, watching the surveyors lay their lines across the sand, knowing that within a generation, this strip of land would become the most important city on Earth. That's the ambition we're talking about. Alexander himself never saw it finished. He died 8 years later in Babylon at 32. But his general, Ptolemy, claimed Egypt and made Alexandria his capital. And the city Alexander imagined, that city would outlast almost everything else he conquered. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty, Alexandria transformed from an ambitious blueprint into the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Ptolemy I and his son Ptolemy II didn't just build a city. They built institutions that would define civilization for centuries. First came the Museion, essentially the world's first state-funded research university. Scholars from across the Mediterranean were invited to Alexandria, paid salaries, given free housing and free meals, and told to do one thing: think, study, discover. No teaching obligations, no political duties, just pure research, funded by the state. And attached to the Museion was the Great Library, which set out to do something no institution had ever attempted: collect every written work in existence. Dr. Bob Breyer called the founding of the library perhaps the most important intellectual event in the history of mankind. And when you look at what it accomplished, it's hard to argue with that. The Ptolemies weren't collecting books as decoration or prestige. They were building a monopoly on human knowledge. Specialized police patrolled the harbor and searched every ship entering port for manuscripts. Any book found on board was confiscated, taken to the library, and copied by professional scribes. The copy was returned to the owner. The original stayed in Alexandria. At its peak, the library held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the accumulated learning of Egypt, Greece, Persia, Babylon, India, and beyond, gathered under one roof. There was nothing like it in the ancient world, and there wouldn't be anything comparable for another 15 centuries. But the Ptolemies weren't only building an empire of the mind. They were also building something the ancient world had never seen. At the entrance to the harbor, on the island of Pharos, they raised the Lighthouse, a three-tiered tower of white limestone and granite, rising between 100 and 118 meters tall, roughly 30 stories. A square base, an octagonal middle section, and a circular top where fire burned every night, reflected and magnified by a system of polished bronze mirrors. Some ancient accounts claimed the light could be seen from over 50 kilometers away. Now imagine you're a merchant sailor approaching Alexandria after weeks on open water. The sky is fading, the horizon is empty, and then you see it. A tower of white stone rising impossibly high above the harbor, fire blazing at its peak, cutting through the dusk like a signal from another world. Behind it stretches the largest, wealthiest, most learned city on earth. That was your first impression of Alexandria. And for 15 centuries, that light never went out. But all of this, the lighthouse, the royal quarters, the palaces where Julius Caesar and Cleopatra once walked, all of it is now underwater. Due to tectonic subsidence over the centuries, the ancient coastline has sunk more than 8 meters below the surface, over 20 feet. Every column, every scroll, every stone. But before any of that happened, there was a golden age, and it produced some of the most remarkable achievements in the history of human thought. Working here at the Museion, a librarian named Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the entire Earth. His method was elegant. He knew that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun was directly overhead in the southern Egyptian city of Siena. A vertical stick cast no shadow. But in Alexandria, 800 kilometers north, a stick did cast a shadow, at an angle of about 7 degrees. Using basic geometry and the measured distance between the two cities, he calculated the Earth's full circumference and got it right to within 1% of the actual value. Over 2,000 years before satellites, using shadows and walking distance. Euclid wrote the elements here, the foundation of geometry still taught in schools today. Herophilus performed the first known systematic human dissections, discovering the distinction between arteries and veins, between sensory and motor nerves. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth orbits the Sun, 17 centuries before Copernicus. And beyond the sciences, the Ptolemies attempted something even more ambitious, the invention of an entirely new religion. The cult of Serapis was designed to fuse Greek and Egyptian traditions into a single shared cultural identity, a synthetic faith built to unify a diverse population. A political and spiritual experiment unlike anything attempted before. Alexandria wasn't just a city of learning, it was a city that controlled learning, an intellectual dragnet, as historians have described it. Ships brought goods from across the Mediterranean. The harbor police ensured the ideas stayed. For over 2 centuries, this system worked, and Alexandria dominated the ancient world not through military conquest, but through knowledge. But no golden age lasts forever, and the first cracks appeared in 48 BC. Julius Caesar's forces, besieged in the harbor district during a civil conflict, set fire to enemy ships. The flames leapt from the water to the dockside warehouses, and ancient sources suggest that part of the library's collection, or at least a significant warehouse of scrolls, was damaged or destroyed in the blaze. For centuries, this was told as a single catastrophic moment, the night the Library of Alexandria burned. It became one of the most famous tragedies in intellectual history. But modern scholars tell a more complicated story. Historian Willeke Vendrich argues the library's true decline wasn't a single fire, but what she calls a slow doom, caused by institutional neglect, cuts in royal funding, political instability, and the inherent fragility of papyrus stored in a humid maritime climate. Not one dramatic blaze, a long, quiet erosion that unfolded over generations. And politically, the age of the Ptolemies was ending. Cleopatra VII, brilliant, multilingual, the last ruler of the dynasty, made her final stand against Rome. And lost. Her palace on the island of Antirodos has since been mapped by modern divers, who found sphinxes, temple remains, and the outlines of royal apartments resting on the harbor floor. The palace of Egypt's last queen, now 20 feet underwater. With Cleopatra's death in 30 BC, Alexandria passed to Rome, and the city's role began to change. Under Roman rule, Alexandria didn't collapse. Far from it. The city adapted and continued to thrive as a vital provincial capital, the breadbasket of the empire, supplying the enormous grain tax that fed Rome itself. The population continued to grow. Trade still flowed through the harbor. And the Serapeum, a monumental sanctuary and temple complex, sometimes called the Daughter Library, still stood as a center of learning and religious life. The great age of discovery may have passed, but the city still functioned. It still felt permanent. Standing in Roman Alexandria, you might have looked around and thought, this will endure. Enough has survived. It hadn't. In 391 AD, the Christian patriarch Theophilus ordered the destruction of the Serapeum. Mobs stormed the sanctuary. Statues were smashed, scrolls were scattered, and the last major branch of the Library of Alexandria was dismantled, not by fire or earthquake, but by decree. Centuries of accumulated knowledge deliberately erased. And then the earth itself turned against the city. On August 21st, 365 AD, a catastrophic earthquake struck beneath the eastern Mediterranean. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus left a terrifying account of what followed. The sea drained away from the harbor, exposing the ocean floor. Ships lay stranded on bare ground. And then a towering wall of water surged back inland, hurling vessels over the tops of buildings and killing an estimated 50,000 people in a single day. The coastline never fully recovered. With each passing century, the ground beneath Alexandria continued to subside, slowly, imperceptibly, but without pause. The royal quarters, the harbor infrastructure, the foundations of the city's most important buildings, all of it, century by century, slipping beneath the waterline. Before we see what's left of this city, and what's now being pulled back from the sea, if you're finding this interesting, subscribing really does help this channel keep going. Between the 10th and 14th centuries, a series of major earthquakes delivered the final blows to what remained. The Pharos Lighthouse, the structure that had defined Alexandria's harbor for over 1,500 years, that had guided countless thousands of ships safely to port, was crippled, cracked, and left standing as a ruin. Each successive earthquake took more of it. The square base fractured, the octagonal midsection buckled. The fire that had burned at its peak for a millennium and a half went dark. The medieval traveler Ibn Battuta visited the site and recorded that the tower had become so ruinous he could no longer even reach its entrance. The greatest lighthouse ever built, and you couldn't walk through the door. By 1480, the Mamluk Sultan Kite Bey ordered the fallen stones of the Pharos gathered up and used to build a military fortress on the same site. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, recycled into fortress walls. Those same stones sit in Kite Bay's citadel to this day. And the harbor continued to subside. The ancient city, its palaces, its temples, its colonnades and streets, sank beneath the Mediterranean. Not destroyed all at once, not consumed in a single dramatic moment, surrendered slowly, century by century, until the entire ancient world lay silent on the ocean floor. Alexandria didn't fall to one catastrophe. It was lost in layers, by fire, by decree, by earthquake, and finally by the slow, patient rise of the sea. For centuries, the ancient city existed only in texts, descriptions by Greek and Roman writers of a place no one could visit anymore. Alexandria became a legend, a story of what the world had lost. Then, in 1994, French archaeologist Jean-Yves Empereur and underwater explorer Franck Gaudiot began systematic dives into Alexandria's harbor. What they found was staggering. Thousands of architectural fragments scattered across the seabed. Columns, statues, sphinxes, and massive carved blocks, lying exactly where they had fallen, preserved beneath layers of silt. And now, in 2025, the Pharos project, led by archaeologist Isabelle Hairy, is going further than anyone thought possible. Teams have captured over 143,000 photogrammetric images, scanning more than 5,000 individual blocks to create a precise digital twin of the lighthouse. Engineers are arranging these scanned fragments like pieces of a giant archaeological puzzle, virtually rebuilding the Pharos so the public can one day explore it in 3 dimensions, as if standing on the island itself. Over 3,300 objects have been catalogued on the harbor floor to date, and the work continues. Alexandria is no longer just a myth preserved in ancient texts. It's becoming something tangible, a digital reality being reclaimed from the waves. The physical city remains hollow beneath the modern streets and silent beneath the harbor. But for the first time in centuries, technology is pulling the lighthouse from the sea. What was lost is being found, and what was forgotten is finally starting to be remembered. Thank you for watching. If there's another lost city or vanished wonder you'd like to see brought back to life, let me know in the comments. I'd love to keep building this journey into the past with you. Until next time.